We started last week in Matthew chapter 8 looking at some of the healing miracles of Jesus as performed in and around the Galilean region. We want to just talk briefly about where we have kind of gone in relationship to who Jesus is. One of the things that we have talked about with the promises that Jesus fulfills from the Old Testament is the promise that Jesus fulfills in the kingdom of God being present here on this earth. We pray that God's kingdom would come and will be done on earth as it is in heaven, but Jesus came to actually fulfill the Old Testament, Old Covenant promise to David. God makes a promise to David that at no point will the throne be empty of someone from David's line, and Jesus fulfills that. But what Jesus comes to do is inaugurate a different sort of a kingdom. You know, they had this in mind that the borders of what is Palestine, that would be the kingdom of God on earth, that small region. But God always had it in mind that kingdom would expand beyond boundaries and borders and touch people's very hearts and lives. And that Jesus' kingdom is not just a kingdom about laws and rules and regulations and behavior, and it does have those things, but it's also a kingdom that is marked by a freedom from the effects and the power of sin and death. And so what you have in the Sermon on the Mount is you have kind of this kingdom ethic. You know, what does it mean to live into this kingdom from a kind of a moral and behavioral standpoint? But then what Jesus does in the healing miracles is demonstrate that there's a power over the darkness of the kingdom of this world, which is marked by sin and disease and brokenness in body. And so Jesus inaugurates this kingdom that we're still living into today. Okay? So when we pray the prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, Jesus began the on earth part of God's will being done. We continue that as his people. And what Jesus does in Matthew 8 is show how the kingdom is not a kingdom of brokenness any longer. It's a kingdom of healing and wholeness. And so we get these healing miracles. Last week we unpacked two of these healing miracles. One is of a leper. Now, I kept wanting to say leopard every time I said leper. It's not right. It's leper. But the leper represents a member of the Jewish community who doesn't live in the Jewish community because he has a disease that causes him to be ceremonially and ritually unclean. He's outside of the community, though he is a member of the community. Then the other healing miracle was of a Roman centurion's servant. So you have this kind of further removed from the center of Jewish life. This is a Gentile who would have been looked down upon because of his status as a Gentile, but not just because of his status as a Gentile, but also because he's a member of the imperial overlords, so to speak, who are taking over the Jewish community. The Gentile would have himself had tremendous kind of governmental authority, but the Jewish audience would have still looked down upon him. And a rabbi of that day would have had nothing to do with him either. But the healing is not for the centurion, is it? It's for the centurion's servant. So you're even another step removed from the center of Jewish life. The point that is significant is that while both subjects were marginalized amongst the Jewish people, Jesus demonstrated his authority over the illness in very different ways. In one way, he touched the leper, which was a no-no. It was a violation of the law, but Jesus' authority overrules and reframes the law itself. He has authority to reframe what it means to show compassion and healing to someone, and he has authority over the disease itself, over the brokenness of the man's body. And he's willing to use that authority to establish and demonstrate the wholeness of the divine kingdom. Now, in the second healing, how does he heal? How does he heal the centurion servant? How does he do it? How does he go about healing the servant? From a distance. So it's the exact opposite of the healing miracle with the leper. The leper, he reaches out and touches. The centurion servant, he doesn't even have to be present with the centurion. And in fact, the centurion demonstrates a tremendous amount of humility in the face of this Jewish rabbi. So from there we go to a third healing miracle in Matthew chapter 8, beginning with verse 14. This is where we left off last week. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Now you can see the line. You have the faith and the healing of the leper, the faith and the healing of a centurion, and the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The healing is very brief in these four verses. It really takes up just 2 verses, but again, it points to the healing of someone who is not at the center of Jewish life. This is not even a Jewish man. This is now a Jewish woman. And he heals a very different type of disease once again. Craig Blomberg, Donald Hagner say that this represents a third kind of healing and a third level of compassion for someone who would have not ordinarily been addressed or talked to by a Jewish rabbi. Regardless of the ways in which Judaism sought to protect women, in many cases, they were still not afforded the same level of respect. And in fact, when there was a teaching moment, the women were often separated from the main area of teaching. The men were the ones that were closest to them. And so here, Jesus is again crossing a social boundary. The detail that we get about the disciples here is telling and will have a profound effect about what Jesus says later about the cost of discipleship. So what do we know right off the bat about Peter from this passage? He's married. He has faith, but he's married. You don't have a mother-in-law without a wife, right? I mean, that's if you're a man, you got to have a wife to have a mother-in-law. And what's interesting here is that Jesus seems to have set up his kind of center or base camp of his ministry here in Capernaum, and likely even in Peter's home, where his mother-in-law is staying. We also know that Peter was married from a passage mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. So Peter has a wife, a mother-in-law, and an extended family. Here, the mother-in-law is sick with a fever. The detail of the fever demonstrates a third kind of healing from the first 2 miracles mentioned in this chapter. We have a skin ailment with the leper, and then we have a paralysis with the centurion's servant, and now we have a fever. Now, again, there's no formal request for healing. At no point does Peter or the mother-in-law ask for the healing. They don't say, hey, please heal me. Instead, Jesus offers it out of compassion. And in keeping with his role to fulfill the purpose of the law, he demonstrates his authority over the social norms of the interaction between Jewish men and Jewish women, and his authority over the physical limitations of the illness. There is little indication in this passage of the severity of the fever, but in Luke's gospel it says it's a high fever. The key to this miracle is that once again, how does Jesus heal the mother-in-law? He touches her, reaches out his hand, puts his hand right on her, and touches her. Again, Jewish rabbis would not have done that. He's not married to this woman, This is not his mother, but he touches her.
How does that differ from he touched her? There was no forethought or conversation about it. He just touched her.
Yeah.
And in the walk with the woman who touched him,
Mm-hmm.
and he felt the touch.
He felt the power. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The connection between the touch and the power. You know, it's interesting because you would think that would be that was a necessity, right? But what's interesting in Matthew, right here in chapter 8, is he sandwiches two miracles where Jesus reaches out and touches the individual that he's healing. He contrasts that with a miracle where he's not even in the same room he's not even in the same vicinity as the person he's healing, right? So the necessity of the touch is not there. He does it, I think, then must do it for a different reason. Now, what you're saying is true. The woman reaches out and touches, Jesus when she's seeking to be healed, and he feels it. So I don't know what metaphysically is going on there. It's a really interesting sort of kind of comparison of how Jesus does healing miracles at different points. And what's highlighted? He can just declare it. At some points he touches. We've seen, not in Matthew's gospel, but we've seen healing miracles where Jesus, when he's healing the man that's blind, what does he do? There are times where he just kind of touches and declares, but then he makes the mud pies. What's that about? I mean, there's all these different things that are happening that the gospel writers are elevating these different details for some reason. And I think the detail of the touch versus the non-touch shows the authority that Jesus has, not just over the illness. He has authority over the illness, but also over the social kind of limitations that would have existed. Because he could have healed the leper with just a word, right? He didn't have to touch him. We know he didn't have, like we said last week, we know he didn't have to touch him because the very next miracle, he's not even present with him. So there must be another reason, right? Does that make sense? So I didn't answer your question because I don't know what the connection is, to be honest with you. I just find it really interesting that Matthew includes those details in different cases to show Jesus' authority, what he has authority over. Yeah, touch has a kind of an emotional quality. There's like an emotional quality to that, the healing aspect of it. Now, who's to say now remember in the healing miracle of the centurion's servant, what does Jesus say he's going to do? Look back. What does he say he's going to do? He says he's going to go. He says he will go, and it's only because of the insistence of the centurion and his humility. No. I am not worthy, that Jesus is overwhelmed by the centurion's faith and heals him from a distance. So he has the ability. Now, Jesus might have crossed another social boundary by going to the centurion's home, because Jewish people did not enter the home of Gentiles. We know when Jesus calls Peter in the book of Acts to go to Cornelius' house. If you read that story, Peter objects to the risen Jesus, by the way, which Peter never learns, right? He's always arguing with Jesus, even after he's like, well, wait a minute, I can't go to a Gentile's house. I've never eaten unclean food, even though Jesus is like, I'm God, I basically tell you what to do. So Jesus is prepared to cross the threshold of a Gentile person's home, but the Gentile has such great faith, greater than Jesus has found in all of Israel, and great humility, and so he demonstrates a different sort of authority. But it's still incredibly interesting there. So Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, And then she gets up and she serves Jesus and the disciples. That she serves the disciples means, in essence, she took on the role of the host for her guests, one of whom is now a famous rabbi and miracle worker. What happens then is Jesus, in his healing miracles, the fame grows. Now, what did we see before the Sermon on the Mount and after the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus was not there were crowds that followed Jesus. Now that the miracles are becoming more commonly known, there is a great swelling of his popularity. And in Mark's version of this story, after the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, it says the entire town came to the house. The entire town. Now, is that dramatic license? I'm sure it is, but it's still a whole lot of people came to the house of Peter and his mother-in-law. What is unique in Matthew's gospel is that the people that show up come to be healed, but the healing that is specifically mentioned is what? What is it? Demon possession. It also says other healings, but the one that's really called out is demon possession. In Mark and Luke, yeah, Ben.
I was wondering when it said demon, I was wondering if that would equate to today in mental illness. We have a granddaughter who has a functional but serious mental illness.
Yeah.
Sometimes things she does is...
There are many commentators and Bible scholars that believe all the demon possession cases in the Bible are mental illness. Do I think that all the cases of mental illness or demon possession described in the Bible are mental illness? No. I think some of them probably are. I think probably even the majority are. But there are some cases where we're going to see some specific demon possession healings where the demons actually talk to Jesus. Now, for those, and as you know, for anyone who's dealt with someone who has a serious mental illness, when they're speaking out of that mental illness, it is like someone else is talking. It is like someone, I mean, even the tone and the tenor of their voice will change. If you've seen that, and it's scary. It's incredibly scary. So I don't discount that in a pre-scientific era that they would have described what we would think of as mental illness as demon possession. So yeah.
Well, I was curious. Our granddaughter has borderline personality disorder. Anybody doesn't know what that is, don't even look at it. And I got a good friend that's a retired psychiatrist, Walter Combs. He said about 35 years ago, he realized those people don't see the world like the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah. They do not. And all the ranges of mental illness, they don't see the world. Whether it's, clinical depression, clinical anxiety, the way of processing what's happening in the world is not the same.
And there's no true borderline personality disorder. There's no drugs.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in this case, what you see with Jesus is he's probably dealing with a lot of people that have ranges of mental illness and other forms of demon possession, which are probably more or less severe. I would think it's, they just didn't have that language back then. They didn't have the language of mental illness. But see, like any other physical illness that we would have, mental illness is the result of the brokenness that's in the world. Just like the man with the leprosy and the high fevers and the brokenness that's in the world, it can only be you can only have the intervention of Jesus Christ. Now, what we see in Scripture today, God uses the great gifts of medical treatment to provide healings. I think several weeks, maybe longer, months ago, I preached on some of the miracles and why don't we see miracles today. I'm like, wait a minute. I think God ordinarily works through ordinary means to accomplish his good work, and there's some miraculous things that happen today that if first century people had seen what we see from a medical thing, they would have called it a miracle. We kind of diminish what God does through ordinary means.
I'll say one other thing.
Yeah.
By the way, it's interesting. One of the best cures and stuff for borderline personality disorder is religious faith.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Religious faith. Religious faith. Yeah. The in Mark and Luke, we get the demon possession, and then in every case, almost every case, when Jesus heals the demon possessed person, the demons are forbidden to say who Jesus is. Jesus tells them, do not, he shuts them up, and he kind of increases the messianic secret. It's unique to Matthew, but not surprising, that Matthew takes this moment of healing and then uses it to talk about a passage from Isaiah. We've seen that pattern in Matthew's gospel where we have that formula, this was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. We get that over and over again. And what the passage that Matthew quotes here is from Isaiah 53, verse 4, which is a famous passage describing the suffering servant of the Lord. Oftentimes, this chapter is used to talk about the sin and the brokenness of the fall that Jesus takes upon himself during the Passion observances. But Matthew uses it here in more of an eschatological kind of a way. He's talking about the idea that Jesus, in demonstrating his healing, is set up to take away those illnesses entirely. At some point, we read in the book of Revelation, there's no more crying, there's no more mourning, there's no more grief, there's no more disease, there's no more mental illness, there's no more leprosy. All of those things are taken away because of what Jesus is doing. What he's doing in these passages is pointing forward to that moment where what he's doing in isolation will be widespread. So this is entirely in step with Matthew's approach to describing who Jesus is. And he follows it then with a brief description of what it actually takes to follow Jesus. Beginning in verse 18. This is what it says. When Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side being the Sea of Galilee. And a scribe came up and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, Follow me, and leave the dead to bury their own dead. The brief kind of exposition of what it takes to follow Jesus acts as an opening frame of another series of 3 miracles which will follow. So, chapter 8, you begin with 3 healing miracles. Then you have this description of what it takes to follow Jesus, and then you have 3 more miracles that will follow through chapter 9, verse 9, and then we will see an individual example of what it takes to follow Jesus as he's describing what it takes to follow Jesus. In 9:9, we see the call of Matthew, and Matthew being called to leave everything to follow Jesus. Now, we've already seen this play out in the lives of the disciples as they leave their nets behind to follow Jesus. What's the scene here is Jesus is on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's getting ready to go to the other side, moving presumably from Capernaum, where the crowds have gathered to be healed. But before he can launch with his disciples, a scribe approaches and declares that he will follow Jesus anywhere. Now, you'll notice something right off the bat. When the scribe approaches Jesus, how does he approach Jesus? How does he address Jesus? Teacher. Now that is a sign of respect, but it's fundamentally different than what we've already seen in chapter 8. How does the leper address Jesus? What does he call him? What does the leper call Jesus? He calls him Lord. Lord. What does the centurion call Jesus? Lord. Now, in the very next scene, what does the one who's described as a disciple call Jesus? Lord. Once again, here the scribe is calling Jesus a teacher. Now, is Jesus a teacher? Absolutely. 100% Jesus is a teacher. Is that all Jesus is? No. He's Lord. Lord is a deeper sign of respect in this case. Now, Eugene Boring points out that no true disciple in Matthew's gospel, no true disciple addresses Jesus as teacher, but as Lord. There's also a little bit of a presumptive tone to the scribe's conversation with Jesus. He's treating Jesus like he would treat any other rabbi. Rabbis would accept students almost like colleges accept students. But that's not how Jesus gets his truest followers. How does Jesus get his truest followers? He calls them. He takes the initiative. He is the one that puts out the specific call. Now, there are those who would follow Jesus, but they will ultimately fall away, at least until the resurrection. Now, the scribe may have been attempting to attach himself to the newest and the most popular teacher of the day, hoping that he would gain a footing for himself. But even if the desire of the scribe is genuine, Jesus unpacks the reality of what it means to follow him. It means a life where this ultimate reality, this place where you and I work and live and where that scribe lived and worked, this is not ultimately our home. Jesus describes himself or calls himself the Son of Man. This is the first time that Jesus uses that term in Matthew's gospel. Now, we don't have time to really get into all that means, that the term Son of Man, but there's plenty that has been written about it. The early church actually rarely used this designation to describe Jesus, so it makes little sense that Jesus is not authentically referring to himself in this way, and that such sayings are authentic. There are critical scholars who look at this and say, well, every time you see Jesus use the Son of Man, that's not authentic, because the early church didn't do that. Actually, the fact that the early church didn't typically call Jesus the Son of Man actually increases the authenticity, that when Jesus does refer to himself that way, that's not an addition, that is authentic. Yes, he does, especially when he's. But a lot of people, when they look at those moments, it's by implication of what he's talking about. And actually, the Son of Man designation here is actually is a messianic reference. It comes from the book of Daniel. We're actually going to get to it just a second. Carolyn.
Yes, okay, so the birds have nests, the foxes have holes, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.
Yes.
Jesus lay his head, did he?
He's talking about a home base, though. He's talking about he doesn't have a home in the same way. We're actually going to get to that in just a second. There's a note of irony in what Jesus is saying here. And he's talking about the cost of discipleship. So the term the Son of Man, it comes from specifically, it's an apocalyptic vision out of the book of Daniel, right? So in the book of Daniel, in chapter 7, beginning with verse 13, Daniel has this vision. This is what it says. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came, so notice, with the clouds of heaven, so he's talking about things from a heavenly standpoint, from the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. So he's seeing an image of someone who is human in form, but coming from heaven, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, to this Son of Man, one like the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So even that term Son of Man, We think of it as a human term, which it does tie to his humanity, but it also ties to his divinity as well, because it goes back to this Daniel 7 vision where he's seeing God descend to the earth as a human being, and to that one is given the kingdom that shall never end, right? The phraseology is divine, but it also has this kingship kind of framework. And given that part of Matthew's presentation of Jesus is as a king, the use of this moniker for Jesus would tie him to a kingdom which is not of this world. Now, we couple that with the authority that Jesus has already been demonstrating over the created order, over people's bodies, and now we have kind of a little bit of a more full view of how Jesus understood his own kingdom and how we should understand that kingdom as well. So, this designation for the Messiah ties his purpose to his humanity as well, and it represents a very ironic note. This is to Carolyn's point. Members of this creation are given the opportunity to build homes, to be secure, and have a sanctuary. But Jesus, who is the king of creation and the judge of all the earth, as Eugene Boring puts it, is a wanderer. Now, does he have a home base? Yes. Capernaum, we've already talked about that. But is that his home? Is he built that home himself? Is that his residence, like his permanent residence? Like if the IRS was asking him, where's your permanent residence, he wouldn't have a place to put it. Now, can he lay his head anywhere? Well, yeah, in a second we're going to see Jesus has the ability to lay his head anywhere he wants. But what he's talking about is that this security, the seeking out of security here for the follower of Jesus, it's not an accurate or it's not a worthy pursuit. Yeah, Terry.
Yeah, but isn't he just answering the scribe's question above? You know, that he says he'll follow him anywhere. Jesus is saying, you know, I don't have a place to lay my head.
Yeah.
Do you really want to go to doing that? You know,
Yes.
that's what he's saying.
I do think that's what he's saying. And there's a good chance, and again, this is reading into the text, which you're never supposed to do that, but we do it anyway all the time. The fact that this is a scribe who's approaching what he thinks is a potential rabbi, and again, that would have been, in his mind, potentially a path to a more secure life here. And Jesus is calling that out, saying, look, if you're going to follow me, you're not going to find security here in this life. In fact, that's not the pursuit of a follower of Jesus. It's not a nesting sort of a calling, right? So I think that is what he's calling out here. The scene is quickly followed by another interaction with Jesus. Now, this pericope is mirrored in Luke chapter 9, verse 57 through 60. But in that passage, Jesus takes the initiative to call the person to follow, and then an excuse of the funeral is given. In Matthew, what is the person called? The first one is called a scribe. What's the second one called? He's actually called a disciple. So perhaps Jesus is talking to one of the actual would-be disciples that he has already called, and as he's preparing to leave Capernaum, there's this excuse, hey, my father has died, let me go to the funeral. But if this is one of the 12 or not, we should understand that this is considered a legitimate follower of Jesus who is not quite all the way down the path of a full disciple, right? Discipleship is a continuum. It's a journey. It's not just a point in time. We're going to talk about sanctification in a few weeks, but just as you see Peter, who trips over himself over and over and over again because he's still growing in his faith for Jesus, what we are seeing here is one who's growing in their faith in Jesus. One of the key differences is that this man addresses Jesus with the same level of respect as we saw the Roman centurion and the leper and the majority of disciples use for Jesus in Matthew. How does he call it? What does he call him? What does the disciple call him? He calls him Lord. Doesn't call him rabbi, he calls him Lord. And then he presents a reasonable, let's make no mistake, this is a reasonable request. And it was a request in keeping with the Mosaic law. The responsibility for a dying or a deceased parent was so great in the Old Testament law that even priests were allowed to touch the dead body of their parents in order to care for them in the funeral arrangements. They weren't allowed to touch dead bodies at all, except in the case of their parents. And they would not be considered defiled at that point. Even if the understanding here is that the father is not yet dead, some people, when they read this, the Greek gets a little bit kind of funny, and some people have said, well, really in the Greek, the disciple is saying, my father is dying. Let me stay and take care of him until the funeral. So there's a potential open timeline which would cause hesitancy on Jesus' part. But even if that is the case, that's still in keeping with the Old Testament law that requires children to step in at the end of life all the way through the mourning period, which could last several months. So Jesus responds in a way that kind of seems a little bit shocking. He says, let the dead bury their dead, but you come and follow me. Or follow me and leave the dead to bury their dead. Now, some people have tried to soften this statement, where Jesus is actually saying, how they interpret it, that Jesus is actually saying, let the spiritually dead bury the physically dead. That those who are not going to follow Jesus, let them do the work of burying the dead. Now, I think, even though this option is presented by very reasonable commentators, the concept of the spiritually dead was not prevalent amongst the Jewish people. That was not a tradition that they had. Eugene Boring notes that the attempt to soften this phrase takes the teeth out of the phrase. Jesus is trying to shock the disciple. He's trying to shock those who are hesitant in following him or giving an excuse to follow him, even if it's a valid one. When you look at the parallel passage in Luke's gospel, there's another incident where someone is wanting to just bid farewell to their family. But Jesus' point is intentionally shocking. Following Jesus means following Jesus and not following anyone or anything else. Does Jesus care about extended families? Yes. This is one of the great things about how Matthew arranges this. He's just healed Peter's mother-in-law. That's an extended family member. He cares about his disciples' families. But at the same time, what's happening with Peter? Peter is being called away from his family. He has already left a career, and Matthew is about to do the same thing. Jesus is saying, look, there are no reasons to delay or supplant the call to follow Jesus. There are only excuses. Terry?
Yeah, well, the big elephant in the room is why didn't the disciple ask Jesus to heal his father?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
If the father was dying, I think that really does play into the whole he's not dying, he's already dead. And perhaps they don't realize that Jesus has the power to raise the dead at that point.
Well, this is probably something very specific that he was trying to prove.
Yeah.
That we don't know, we don't understand.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Still kind of confusing to let a dead person bury a dead person.
Well, and that's where some commentators, I think, it makes a lot of sense why some commentators and scholars want to soften the phrase to say the spiritually dead bury the physically dead. But I think the idea is that the dead are dead, right? What Jesus has come to do is bring life. Now, do they understand that it's physical life, that there's physical life? I don't know. But to your point, Terry, though, the miracles of Jesus have a very specific purpose. That's why there are some that Jesus didn't heal. Jesus did not heal everyone. He healed a lot, Let's come on. Let's. People say, "Oh, Jesus didn't heal that many." Well, there are sometimes in the Gospels where they can't even enumerate. They just say a whole bunch. I mean, this like in Mark, it says the whole town of Capernaum came and he healed their sick. It doesn't say he healed some of their sick. He said that he healed their sick, right? In Matthew's Gospel, it says he healed their sick and the demon possessed. So he healed a lot, but did he heal all of them? No. And the ones that we know about are told to us for a very specific purpose, to demonstrate something about the authority of Jesus over traditions, over the body as well. We're going to stop right there. We still have a few minutes, but we're going to stop right there because I do want to really take some time with the calming of the storm miracle, because this will represent yet another example of Jesus' authority over the brokenness in the world, and a different level. And one of the things is, if you read this week ahead, notice the differences in how the disciples respond to their peril versus how the leper responds, versus how the Roman centurion responds, versus how Peter's mother-in-law responds to their illness. Notice the differences there in how the disciples respond, and then what Jesus' posture is. I think it's incredibly interesting. It's one of my favorite stories in the life of Jesus is the calming of the storm. It's one of my favorites because there's so much detail that tells us a lot about who Jesus is and what it means to have faith. Because I think what we often think of as faith, Jesus thinks of as a little faith. Any questions about what we've had this? Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
When Jesus called his disciples, didn't he say to each one of them, follow me right now?
Yes.
I mean, there wasn't any, let's talk about this.
Yeah, so for those that watching, Carolyn makes the good point. When Jesus says to follow to the 12, you're referring to the 12, he doesn't say, get your affairs in order and then come follow me. He says, follow me. And they do, they do without hesitation, with some exceptions. I mean, in John's gospel, we get a lot more hesitation, but even there, so interesting, in John's gospel, we get the call of Peter and James, and then you get the Philip and Nathaniel. Do you remember? And Andrew comes to talk to them about Jesus. And remember the response that when Andrew comes and talks to them about following Jesus, I think it's Nathaniel. What does Nathaniel say? Can anything good come from Nazareth? Right? But when Jesus talks to him, it's immediate. So that, to your point, when Jesus calls, it's an immediate reaction. Even when other people call on behalf of Jesus, it's not always immediate. That's a good point, though. And what we're going to see, too, in Matthew, in the call of Matthew, is the same thing. Jesus sees Matthew. Matthew leaves his tax collector's booth behind. And Jesus takes the initiative there, which is incredible to me. Okay. Next week, we're going to talk about the storm, and then we will continue into another healing miracle of Jesus. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for your goodness to us and the authority that you've shown over this earth and over our lives. And Lord, help us to be excited about that and to trust you, that in you we understand what it really means to have life and to be whole, and that we would reflect that wholeness to others. In Jesus' name, amen.